hands flat on the metal. The words sliced through the cool morning air like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. "Don't you dare move." The barrel of the service weapon hovered 6 inches from Marcus Sullivan's spine, steady as a promise of violence. Hard hands shoved him forward, chest first against the hood of his own sedan, the pressure grinding through his wool coat like they were trying to press compliance into his very marrow. "Stop fighting us." The accusation cracked across the suburban silence, even though Marcus hadn't moved a muscle. Even though his hands were already raised. Even though he'd been standing perfectly still. Marcus kept his breathing measured, his shoulders rigid, his eyes focused on a fixed point ahead. They didn't know. These 2 officers, with their weapons drawn and their voices raised, didn't know they were pinning down a man who had sat across from senators. They didn't know his phone held direct lines to offices most people only saw on television. They didn't know that one call from this sidewalk would unravel their entire careers. Before we go deeper into this case, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The morning had started like every other Wednesday. Marcus had checked his watch as he stepped out onto his front porch, the crisp October air carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and fallen leaves. His briefcase held the finalized proposal for the youth mentorship program, carefully organized documents that required signatures from the foundation board by 2 o'clock. His charcoal suit jacket fit perfectly over his pressed white shirt and burgundy tie, the kind of professional presentation he'd maintained through 18 years of nonprofit leadership. The street stretched quiet before him. Maple trees lined the sidewalk, their branches forming golden canopies overhead. American flags hung motionless from several porches, testament to the neighborhood's careful respectability. Bicycles lay scattered on driveways, evidence of children who'd pedaled home from school yesterday and left their wheels where they'd dismounted. Everything looked peaceful, orderly, safe. Marcus breathed deep, appreciating the autumn morning as he descended his front steps. His leather briefcase felt substantial in his hand, weighted with months of planning and coordination. The foundation meeting was 12 blocks away, an easy walk through a neighborhood he'd called home for nearly a decade. A patrol car appeared at the intersection behind him, moving slow. Marcus noted its presence without turning his head, maintaining his steady pace down the sidewalk. 18 years of experience had taught him how to navigate these moments without alarm, how to keep his movements calm and predictable, how to avoid any gesture that might be misinterpreted as threat or flight. The engine suddenly roared to life. Tires squealed against asphalt as the patrol car surged forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. The sound shattered the morning calm like glass breaking in an empty room. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but he forced himself to keep walking, one measured step after another, his briefcase held loosely at his side. Car doors flew open with sharp metallic cracks. "Freeze right there." The command came sharp and immediate, carrying the weight of authority backed by weapons. Marcus stopped mid-stride, his fingers tightening slightly on the briefcase handle. 2 officers emerged with practiced aggression, their boots hitting pavement hard as they spread out into flanking positions. Derek Lawson and Travis McBride. Their hands moved to their holsters with frightening speed, weapons clearing leather and rising to aim at Marcus's center mass in one smooth motion. Both guns pointed directly at his chest. From her living room window 3 houses down, Patricia Daniels stood watching, her face visible through sheer white curtains. Her expression held something that looked almost like satisfaction as she observed the scene unfolding, hands clasped at her waist. Marcus caught sight of her for just a moment before returning his focus to the immediate danger. "Show me your hands." Lawson's voice cut sharp as a whip crack. Marcus slowly raised both arms, his briefcase still gripped in his right hand, his heart hammering against his ribs, even as his voice remained steady and calm. "Officers, I'm happy to cooperate. Can you tell me what this is about? I'm just heading to a meeting." "Drop the case and shut your mouth," McBride barked, moving closer with his weapon trained and unwavering. Behind her curtain, Patricia Daniels's lips curved into a thin smile. Marcus carefully lowered his briefcase to the sidewalk, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were handling something fragile. The leather case contained grant applications that represented 6 months of work, partnerships carefully cultivated, budgets meticulously planned. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, survival meant following orders precisely, moving with exaggerated care, making himself appear as unthreatening as humanly possible. I'm complying, officers. My identification is in my jacket pocket if you need to verify my address. I live right here on this street. Did we ask for your life story? Lawson's voice rose sharply. Keep your hands where we can see them, and stop talking. Turn around. Face the vehicle. Get on your knees. Lawson rapid-fired contradictory commands, each one delivered with increasing volume. Hands behind your head. Flat on the ground. Don't you dare move. Marcus's mind worked quickly to process the conflicting orders while keeping his body motionless. Sweat formed at his temples, despite the cool air. 18 years of navigating situations exactly like this had taught him the calculus of survival. Move with exaggerated slowness. Speak in soft tones. Make yourself small. Make yourself harmless. Make yourself somehow less threatening to men with guns drawn and adrenaline pumping. I'm following your instructions, he said evenly, though his throat felt constricted. Please, just tell me what's happening so I can help resolve this. Officer McBride circled behind him, boots scraping across fallen leaves. Marcus fought every instinct to turn his head, keeping his gaze fixed forward and his hands visible. His legs trembled slightly from holding the awkward half-raised position, muscles burning from the strain of enforced stillness. Someone called in a suspicious person. Lawson sneered, his weapon still aimed center mass. You match the description. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew exactly who had made that call and why, though arguing would only make things worse. Officers, I've lived on this street for 9 years. I'm heading to a meeting at the Riverside Foundation. My identification can confirm my address if you'll allow me to reach for it slowly. Nobody told you to speak. Lawson's voice cracked like thunder across the quiet street. Keep your mouth shut before you make this worse. McBride moved closer, his presence a looming threat, just beyond Marcus's peripheral vision. Without warning, the officer's hand clamped around Marcus's right arm, wrenching it roughly backward. The sudden force threw Marcus off balance. He stumbled, trying to maintain his footing while keeping his hands visible and his demeanor calm. Officer, please. I'm not resisting. Stop resisting. Lawson roared, his voice echoing down the tree-lined street. The words hung in the air, like an accusation, already written into official records. Patricia Daniels pressed closer to her window, drinking in the scene with undisguised interest. Other curtains began to shift along the street as neighbors peered out, drawn by Lawson's shouting. The peaceful autumn morning had fractured into something ugly and familiar. From her front porch directly across the street, Evelyn Moss emerged silently, her smartphone already raised. Her weathered hands moved with surprising steadiness as she pressed record, capturing every moment of what was unfolding before her. Her doorbell camera blinked its silent red indicator light, collecting footage that would soon become crucial evidence. Marcus remained absolutely still, despite the pain shooting through his twisted arm, despite the weapon still pointed at vital organs, despite the knowledge that this moment balanced on a razor's edge between survival and tragedy. His tie shifted slightly in the morning breeze, the burgundy silk catching light as his chest rose and fell with carefully controlled breathing. Get down. McBride yanked harder on Marcus's arm, forcing him toward his knees. The pavement felt cold and hard through his dress slacks as he knelt, maintaining his composure even as humiliation burned through his chest. Lawson holstered his weapon and produced handcuffs, the metal glinting in the October sunlight. The cold steel closed around Marcus's wrists with practiced efficiency, ratcheting tight enough to bite into skin. Click, click, click. Each notch felt like a door closing, like options narrowing, like dignity being stripped away on a public street in front of neighbors he'd known for years. You're under arrest for resisting arrest and suspicious behavior. Lawson recited the words with mechanical efficiency, as if he'd said them 1,000 times before. Marcus forced himself to speak calmly, despite the absurdity of the charges. "I haven't resisted anything, officer. I've complied with every instruction. That mouth of yours is what's resisting." McBride grabbed Marcus's shoulder, pushing him roughly toward the patrol car. "Your attitude needs adjustment." They hauled him to his feet, still cuffed, and shoved him toward the vehicle's rear door. Marcus moved carefully, his briefcase abandoned on the sidewalk where he'd placed it, his carefully planned morning destroyed. As they pushed his head down to force him into the back seat, he caught one more glimpse of Patricia Daniels at her window. She was smiling. The car door slammed shut with brutal finality, sealing Marcus inside a cage of metal and mesh. The officers climbed into the front seats, their conversation muffled through the barrier separating prisoner from police. Through the window, Marcus watched Evelyn Moss still recording, her phone aimed steadily at the patrol car, her face set in grim determination. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving Marcus's briefcase lying on the sidewalk like evidence of a crime that had never actually been committed. The processing room at the downtown precinct smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, harsh fluorescent lights washing everything in pale yellow. Marcus sat handcuffed to a metal bench bolted to the concrete floor, his wrists still aching from where the cuffs had bitten into skin during the ride. His charcoal suit jacket hung wrinkled now, his burgundy tie loosened, his professional appearance compromised, but his composure intact. Officer Lawson stood near the booking desk, filling out paperwork with methodical strokes of his pen. McBride leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, watching Marcus with an expression that mixed boredom and contempt. Neither officer seemed concerned about the lack of actual evidence or the absurdity of the charges they'd filed. A clock on the wall read 10:15. Marcus had been scheduled to arrive at the foundation by 11. His phone was sealed, in an evidence bag somewhere in this building, along with his wallet, keys, and briefcase. The proposal that had taken 6 months to develop sat abandoned on a sidewalk 12 blocks away, assuming someone had bothered to secure it. "You going to give us any more trouble?" McBride asked, his tone suggesting he hoped for a yes. Marcus kept his voice level. "I haven't given you any trouble, officer. I've complied completely since the moment you stopped me." "That attitude." Lawson looked up from his paperwork, shaking his head. "That's the problem right there. You think you're better than us." Marcus said nothing, recognizing the trap being laid. Anything he said would be twisted. Any defense would be labeled arrogance. Any silence would be called admission. He'd learned this pattern years ago, watching it play out in courtrooms and police stations across the country. The best strategy was to remain calm, document everything, and wait for the opportunity to access legal representation. The door opened, and a third officer entered. Captain Sharon Hayes, according to the nameplate on her uniform. She carried a tablet and wore an expression of professional neutrality as she approached the booking desk. "What have we got here?" Hayes asked, glancing at the paperwork Lawson had been completing. "Suspicious person, resisting arrest." Lawson handed over the forms. "Got called to a residential area, matched the description. Subject became combative during the stop." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Every word was a lie, carefully crafted to justify the unjustifiable. He made mental notes of each false statement, committing the details to memory for the accounting that would eventually come. Hayes scanned the paperwork, her expression unchanging. Then she looked directly at Marcus for the first time, her gaze assessing. "You have anything to say?" "I'd like to speak with an attorney," Marcus replied calmly. "I have the right to legal counsel and a phone call." Hayes nodded once, a gesture that might have been approval, or simply acknowledgement of proper procedure. She turned to Lawson. "Get him processed and into holding. Make sure he gets his call." Lawson's expression soured slightly, but he nodded. "Come on." He unlocked Marcus from the bench and pulled him to his feet, guiding him toward the fingerprinting station with unnecessary force. The booking process stripped away layer after layer of dignity. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property inventory. each step designed to transform a person into a case number, an individual into a statistic. Marcus moved through it with practiced calm, his mind already working through the steps that would follow the arraignment, the bail hearing, the eventual trial if it came to that. Finally, they brought him to a holding cell, a small concrete room with a steel bench and a toilet in the corner. The door clanged shut with echoing finality. Marcus sat on the bench, alone at last, and allowed himself a moment to close his eyes and breathe deeply. Then he began to plan. The phone call came an hour later. A guard escorted Marcus to a wall-mounted phone in the corridor, its receiver scratched and worn from thousands of desperate conversations. Marcus lifted it carefully, his cuffed hands awkward as he dialed from memory. The line rang 3 times before a professional voice answered. Montgomery Legal Associates. How may I direct your call? This is Marcus Sullivan. I need to speak with attorney Rebecca Montgomery immediately. Tell her it's an emergency. A brief pause. 1 moment, please. The hold music seemed to stretch forever, seconds expanding into minutes as Marcus stood in the institutional corridor, guard watching nearby, other detainees visible through cell doors. Finally, the line clicked. Marcus? Rebecca Montgomery's voice came through sharp with concern. What happened? Marcus spoke quickly and precisely, laying out the facts in chronological order, the stop without reasonable suspicion, the contradictory commands, the fabricated charges of resisting arrest when he'd complied completely, the false claims in the official report. His voice remained steady throughout, each detail delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly how critical accuracy would be. Rebecca listened without interruption until he finished. Okay. First, do not say anything else to anyone. Not the guards, not other detainees, not the officers who arrested you. Nothing. I'm filing for immediate release, and I'll be there within the hour for the arraignment. There's something else. Marcus lowered his voice slightly. I need you to make another call for me. To Washington. A pause. You're sure about that? I'm sure. Marcus recited a phone number from memory, watching the guard's impassive face. Tell them Marcus Sullivan needs immediate federal intervention in a civil rights violation. They'll know what it means. Rebecca's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Consider it done. Sit tight, Marcus. We're going to burn this to the ground. The line went dead. Marcus hung up the receiver and allowed the guard to escort him back to the holding cell. The concrete bench felt cold through his dress slacks as he sat, but his mind was already several moves ahead, visualizing the chain of events his phone calls would set in motion. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. Hours passed in the peculiar time distortion that happens in windowless rooms with nothing but fluorescent lights and the sounds of distant voices. Marcus sat with his back against the cold wall, conserving energy, thinking through contingencies. Other detainees came and went, their charges ranging from drunk and disorderly to more serious offenses. None spoke to him, and he offered no conversation. At 3:45, the guard returned. Sullivan, you're up for arraignment. They transported him through underground corridors to the courthouse, emerging into a courtroom that smelled of old wood and anxiety. The gallery held a scattering of people, family members, attorneys, court personnel. Marcus scanned the faces and found Rebecca Montgomery sitting in the front row, her expression professionally composed but her eyes communicating volumes. The bailiff called his case. The State versus Marcus Sullivan. Charges of resisting arrest and suspicious behavior. The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney named James Webb, stood to present the state's case. Your Honor, the defendant matched the description of a suspicious person in a residential neighborhood. When officers attempted to question him, he became combative and resisted arrest. We're asking for bail to be set at $50,000. Rebecca rose smoothly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd fought these battles for 20 years. Your Honor, my client is a respected nonprofit director with 18 years of community service. He has deep roots in this city, no prior record, and poses absolutely no flight risk. The charges are baseless. He was walking to a meeting on his own street when he was stopped without probable cause, given contradictory commands, and arrested for the crime of remaining calm while black. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Chen, looked up from the file before her. The defense has some compelling points. What evidence does the state have that Mr. Sullivan was actually resisting? Webb shifted his weight slightly. The officer's testimony, Your Honor. They both observed. Judge Chen raised a hand. Let me rephrase. Do you have any video evidence? Body camera footage? Dashboard camera? Witness statements from anyone other than the arresting officers? Webb's silence answered louder than words. Judge Chen set down her file. Bail is set at personal recognizance. Mr. Sullivan, you're free to go pending trial. She looked directly at the prosecutor. Mr. Webb, I suggest the district attorney's office review this case very carefully before proceeding. That's all. The gavel fell. Marcus felt tension drain from his shoulders as the bailiff removed his handcuffs. Rebecca touched his arm briefly, a gesture of support and shared understanding, then nodded toward the exit. Let's talk outside. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, the autumn air feeling crisp and clean after hours in fluorescent-lit concrete rooms. Rebecca guided him to a quiet corner of the courthouse steps, away from the flow of people entering and exiting. Your call to Washington went through. Rebecca kept her voice low. They're treating this as a priority civil rights violation. Federal investigators are already being assigned. Marcus nodded slowly, processing the implications. And locally? I've reached out to Evelyn Moss, your neighbor, who filmed the arrest. She's already provided me with copies of her footage, both from her phone and her doorbell camera. Marcus, this video is damning. It shows you complying with every command, shows the officers manufacturing the resistance charge, shows the whole thing from start to finish. Marcus felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. What about Patricia Daniels? Rebecca's expression hardened. The woman who called it in? I'm already drafting a civil suit for false reporting and malicious prosecution, but that's secondary. The primary focus is the officers and the department that enabled them. They stood in silence for a moment, watching people move through their ordinary days, unaware of the machinery of justice grinding its slow gears nearby. What happens next? Marcus asked finally. Now we document everything. Rebecca pulled out her tablet. I need a complete timeline from you. Every detail you remember, every word spoken, every action taken. I need names of everyone you interacted with today, before and after the arrest. I need you to write down everything about your relationship with that neighborhood, your reputation, your work history, everything that establishes who you actually are versus who they tried to make you into. Marcus looked out across the courthouse plaza, where a fountain splashed peacefully in the center of a small park. I thought I understood how this worked. I thought after 18 years of navigating these spaces, I'd learned how to avoid this. Rebecca's voice softened. This wasn't about what you did wrong, Marcus. This was about officers who felt empowered to abuse their authority, and a woman who felt entitled to weaponize police against a black man in her neighborhood. You did everything right. The system failed, not you. They discussed logistics for another 20 minutes. Evidence preservation, witness interviews, the federal investigation timeline. Finally, Rebecca checked her watch. I need to get back to the office and start filing motions. Can someone pick you up? Marcus pulled out his phone, finally returned to him, along with his other belongings. I'll call my brother. And Rebecca? Thank you. For everything. She smiled, the professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine warmth. We're going to make them regret the day they decided you were suspicious for walking down your own street. Marcus's brother Anthony arrived 30 minutes later, pulling up to the courthouse in a navy blue sedan. He climbed out quickly, his face etched with concern and barely controlled anger. Marcus walked down the courthouse steps to meet him, still wearing his wrinkled suit, still carrying the weight of the day in his shoulders. They embraced briefly, Anthony's grip tight and fierce. You okay? Physically, yes. Marcus stepped back, managing a tired smile. Everything else is complicated. The drive home was mostly silent, the city passing by outside the windows as afternoon faded toward evening. Anthony's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, jaw working as he clearly fought to contain his fury. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me what you need. Documentation. Witnesses. Evidence that contradicts their version of events." Marcus stared out the passenger window. "And I need my briefcase. It's probably still lying on the sidewalk where they forced me to drop it." Anthony's voice came out tight and controlled. "We'll get it. What else?" "I need to contact the foundation. Explain why I missed the meeting. I need to start writing everything down while it's fresh. I need to." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. "I need to make sure this doesn't just disappear into the system like it never happened." "It won't." Anthony's voice carried absolute certainty. "Not this time." They turned onto Marcus's street as the sun touched the horizon, painting the suburban neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. Several neighbors were visible on their porches, some watering lawns, others sitting on porch swings, a few children playing in yards. As Anthony's car approached, conversation stopped. People turned to look. The street that had felt like home for 9 years suddenly felt like a stage where Marcus had become the unwilling star of a performance he'd never auditioned for. Anthony pulled into Marcus's driveway. The briefcase sat exactly where Marcus had dropped it, still lying on the sidewalk as if frozen in time. Someone had placed a small rock on top of it to keep papers from blowing away, a gesture of minimal care that somehow felt both kind and inadequate. Marcus climbed out of the car, his legs stiff from the day's stress. He walked to the briefcase, bent down, and lifted it carefully. The leather felt solid and familiar in his hand, a connection to the morning's ordinary intentions before everything had gone wrong. Evelyn Moss emerged from her house across the street, moving with surprising speed for her 72 years. Her phone was in her hand, but this time it hung at her side rather than pointed forward. "Marcus," she called out. "I saved everything. Every second of footage." "Thank you, Evelyn." Marcus's voice carried genuine gratitude. "My attorney will be in touch to get copies for the official record." Evelyn came closer, her expression fierce beneath her silver hair. "I've lived on this street for 43 years. I've watched this neighborhood change, watched people come and go. You're one of the good ones, Marcus. What they did to you today was criminal." Other neighbors began to emerge. Thomas Garrett from 2 doors down, still wearing his mechanic's coveralls from work. The Chen family from across the street. Parents and 2 teenagers. Even old Mr. Patterson, who rarely left his house except for medical appointments. "We saw what happened," Thomas said quietly, approaching with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Some of us, we didn't know what to do. We should have done something. You're doing something now." Marcus looked at the small gathering of neighbors, seeing something shift in their faces, shame mixing with determination. Being witnesses matters. Being willing to testify if it comes to that matters even more. Mrs. Chen spoke up, her accent thick, but her words clear. "We will testify. My husband and I, we both saw. Our doorbell camera, it caught everything too." One by one, neighbors stepped forward with similar statements. Promises of cooperation, offers of video footage, expressions of support that should have come hours earlier, but were arriving now, late but not too late to matter. Patricia Daniels's house remained dark and silent, curtains drawn tight against the gathering. Marcus looked at her windows for a long moment, thinking about the phone call that had set everything in motion. The false report, the malicious intent, the weaponization of fear and authority against a man whose only crime had been walking while black on his own street. Anthony stood beside Marcus, his presence solid and protective. "You don't have to deal with all this tonight," he said quietly. "Come stay with Michelle and me for a few days." Marcus shook his head. "No, this is my home. I'm not letting them drive me out of it." They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by neighbors who'd finally found their courage. facing a house whose owner had become the embodiment of casual cruelty. The street felt different now, not comfortable, not safe, but at least no longer indifferent. Eventually, the neighbors dispersed, returning to their homes with promises to stay in touch, to provide whatever was needed. Marcus and Anthony went inside, closing the door against the October evening and the day's accumulated trauma. The house felt both familiar and foreign, as if the morning's events had altered the space itself. Marcus set his briefcase on the dining room table, hung his jacket over a chair, and loosened his tie completely. The burgundy silk slipped through his fingers, and he stared at it for a moment, thinking about how close he'd come to never removing it himself. Anthony moved through the house with purpose, checking locks, closing curtains, making coffee without being asked. The ritual of ordinary tasks felt grounding, pulling them both back toward something resembling normalcy. Finally, they sat at the kitchen table with steaming mugs, the overhead light casting warm circles in the gathering darkness. Anthony pulled out his phone. "I'm going to help you document everything. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." Marcus began to speak, reconstructing the morning hour by hour, minute by minute. The walk down his front steps, the patrol car's sudden acceleration, the contradictory commands, the manufactured resistance charge. Anthony typed rapidly on his phone, creating a detailed timeline that could be cross-referenced with Evelyn's video footage and other witnesses' accounts. When Marcus reached the part about the booking process, his voice faltered slightly. "The way they looked at me, Anthony, like I was less than human, like my compliance meant nothing, my dignity meant nothing, my entire life meant nothing." Anthony looked up from his phone, his expression holding both pain and understanding. "I know, brother. I know." They worked for another hour, documenting everything Marcus could remember: phone conversations, officer names, exact quotes where memory allowed, the prosecutor's weak arguments, Judge Chen's pointed questions, Rebecca Montgomery's fierce advocacy, every detail that might matter in the battles ahead. Finally, exhausted, Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I thought I was too educated for this, too established, too careful in how I carried myself. If you were in Marcus's position, experiencing this kind of injustice, despite doing everything right, what would your next step be? Share your thoughts in the comments." Anthony set down his phone. "You know that's not how it works. You've always known." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I just hoped I was wrong." The evening stretched on, marked by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional sound of cars passing outside. They discussed strategy, contingencies, the realistic timeline for justice. Federal investigations moved slowly but thoroughly. Civil suits took years to resolve. Criminal charges against police officers rarely stuck, even with video evidence. "But this time feels different," Anthony said finally. "The video is clear. The witness list is solid. The federal government is already involved. And you've got connections that most people in your situation don't have." Marcus thought about the phone call Rebecca had made to Washington, about relationships built over 18 years of nonprofit work, about senators he'd testified before, officials he'd collaborated with, networks of influence he'd cultivated without ever expecting to need them for something like this. The question is whether those connections actually mean anything when the system protects its own. Anthony's smile held no humor. "I guess we're about to find out." They sat in companionable silence for a while, brothers who'd grown up navigating the same contradictions, the same dangers, the same exhausting requirement to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. The kitchen grew dark around them until Anthony finally stood and flipped on another light. "You need to eat something," he said, moving toward the refrigerator. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Marcus realized he couldn't remember. Breakfast felt like it had happened in another lifetime, before the patrol car's acceleration had severed his day into before and after. Anthony assembled sandwiches with practiced efficiency, setting one in front of Marcus along with a glass of water. "Eat. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Marcus ate mechanically, his mind already jumping ahead to the next steps. Meetings with Rebecca, interviews with federal investigators, coordination with witnesses. The slow, grinding machinery of justice that moved forward inch by painful inch. His phone buzzed with incoming messages. Text after text from colleagues, friends, community members who'd heard about his arrest through the neighborhood grapevine. Offers of support, expressions of outrage, promises of solidarity. Marcus scrolled through them, feeling the weight of community care, even as exhaustion pulled at his bones. One message stood out, sent from an unknown number, but containing information that made Marcus sit up straighter. This is Special Agent Monica Rivera, FBI Civil Rights Division. I've been assigned to your case. I'll be in contact tomorrow to schedule an initial interview. Please preserve all evidence and do not discuss details publicly until we've had a chance to talk. Your attorney has my contact information. Marcus showed the message to Anthony, who read it with grim satisfaction. They're taking this seriously. The timing matters. Marcus set down his phone. Federal attention this quick means someone high up made this a priority. Which brings us back to those Washington connections. Anthony finished his sandwich, watching his brother carefully. You ready for the spotlight this is going to bring? Marcus thought about it, the news coverage that would inevitably follow, the public scrutiny, the social media debates, the way his life would become a flashpoint in larger conversations about policing and race and justice. Ready or not, here it comes. The brothers cleaned up the kitchen together, falling into the rhythms of shared household tasks that dated back to childhood. Washing dishes, wiping counters, the ordinary work of maintaining life in the midst of chaos. Anthony stayed until past midnight, reluctant to leave Marcus alone with his thoughts and the day's trauma. They sat together in the living room, the television muted, two brothers processing what had happened through the language of shared silence. Finally, Marcus insisted, "Go home to Michelle. Tell her I appreciate you both. Tell her I'm sorry for worrying everyone. There's nothing to apologize for." Anthony stood, pulling his brother into another embrace. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is on you." His voice carried fierce conviction. "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all, anytime. 2 a.m? Doesn't matter. I'm here." "I know." Marcus felt the truth of those words settle into his chest. "We're in this together. Always have been. Always will be." Anthony gripped his shoulder one more time before heading toward the door. "Lock this behind me, and actually get some sleep if you can." After Anthony left, Marcus stood alone in his quiet house, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. The familiar sounds felt different now, layered with new awareness of how quickly safety could evaporate, how thin the veneer of civilization actually was. He walked through each room methodically, touching familiar objects as if to confirm their reality. The bookshelves he'd assembled one Sunday afternoon, hands cramping from wielding the Allen wrench, but satisfied with the solid result. The photographs on the walls, documenting 9 years of community work, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, youth program graduations, neighborhood cleanup days where he'd worked alongside residents who now might question whether he belonged. In his home office, Marcus ran his fingers along the spines of books he'd collected over years of professional development, texts on nonprofit management, community organizing, youth development theories. All that education, all that expertise, meaningless in the face of 2 officers who'd decided his existence in this neighborhood constituted suspicious behavior. The desk held remnants of his interrupted morning notes for the foundation presentation scattered across its surface, the backup copy of the grant proposal he'd never delivered, a coffee mug with cold dregs still visible at the bottom. He'd left this house as a professional heading to an important meeting. He'd returned as a criminal defendant, fingerprinted and photographed and processed through systems designed to strip away dignity. Marcus sank into his desk chair, the familiar creak of leather somehow grounding. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing, documenting everything while memory remained sharp. Not just the arrest itself, but the feelings it had provoked, the fear, the humiliation, the helpless rage at being unable to control a situation through compliance alone. Writing helped. Transforming emotion into words on paper created distance, made the experience something that could be analyzed rather than simply endured. He filled page after page with observations, questions, connections to larger patterns he'd studied but never experienced so viscerally. When his hand cramped from gripping the pen too tightly, Marcus set down the legal pad and checked the time. Nearly 1 in the morning. His body felt exhausted, but his mind raced with adrenaline and replaying scenarios. What if he'd said something different? What if the video evidence didn't exist? What if Judge Chen had set bail higher than he could afford? So many things that could have gone worse. So many places where the system's casual cruelty could have ground him down more thoroughly. He'd been lucky in ways that shouldn't require luck, having a neighbor who documented injustice, having an attorney who believed his account, having a judge willing to question prosecution narratives. Marcus made his way to his bedroom, finally allowing himself to change out of the suit that had been pressed so carefully this morning and had become wrinkled evidence of state-sanctioned violence. He hung it in the closet with care, despite wanting to burn it, recognizing it might be needed as physical evidence of what professional presentation meant to officers who'd decided professionalism couldn't possibly belong to someone who looked like him. The charcoal jacket, the white shirt with its perfect collar now crumpled, the burgundy tie that had shifted during the arrest, all of it testimony to how appearance meant nothing when prejudice had already written its verdict. Marcus ran his hand down the sleeve one more time before closing the closet door. In the bathroom, he went through evening routines on autopilot, brushing teeth, washing face, the ordinary rituals that connected this terrible day to all the normal days that had preceded it. His reflection in the mirror looked older, new lines visible around his eyes, new weariness etched into features that had smiled easily this morning. Marcus studied his own face, seeing not just himself, but all the men who looked like him and had endured similar violations. His father, pulled over for driving while black more times than he could count. His grandfather, who'd survived Jim Crow by learning when to make himself invisible. His great-grandfather, whose stories of surviving worse indignities were family history passed down through generations. Each generation had believed, hoped, that the next would face less, that education would protect them, that professional achievement would shield them, that the arc of history really did bend toward justice. Marcus had inherited that hope, had built his life on that foundation. Today had shattered it. Or maybe not shattered, cracked, certainly, damaged significantly, but not destroyed entirely. After all, he'd made it home. The charges would likely be dropped. The federal investigation would proceed. Justice, however delayed and incomplete, remained theoretically possible. In bed, Marcus lay staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to quiet despite his body's exhaustion. Every creak of the house settling made him tense. Every distant sound of traffic triggered alertness, born from hypervigilance. Sleep felt impossible, his nervous system stuck in fight-or-flight mode, hours after the immediate danger had passed. He tried breathing exercises his therapist had taught him years ago for managing stress. Slow inhale through the nose, slower exhale through the mouth, counting breaths to anchor awareness in the present moment. It helped marginally, pulling him back from spiraling anxiety, but not enough to produce actual rest. Finally, exhausted beyond the capacity to maintain consciousness, sleep came anyway, but it brought no relief, only dreams that replayed the morning's events with surreal variations. Guns that grew larger as they pointed at his chest. Handcuffs that tightened until they cut circulation. Officers whose faces shifted between familiar and monstrous as they shouted contradictory commands he couldn't possibly follow. Marcus woke repeatedly through the night, each time disoriented and taking seconds to remember where he was, why his heart raced, what had happened to transform his life between sunrise and sunset. Each time, the realization hit fresh, arrested, processed, released on recognizance, facing charges for a crime he hadn't committed. Around 4 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely. Marcus went downstairs and made coffee, standing in his kitchen as dawn approached with aching slowness. Through the window, he could see his street beginning to wake, porch lights flickering on. Newspapers being collected. The ordinary rhythms of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Marcus knew it with certainty that settled into his bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The legal battle was just beginning. The fight for accountability would consume months or years. His life had been divided into before and after, and there was no going back to the innocence of that before. For now, in the pre-dawn quiet, he'd survived. He was home, safe, if not exactly comfortable, alive, and capable of fighting back with tools beyond physical resistance. Legal expertise, federal connections, community support, video evidence. All the advantages that made justice possible, even if they shouldn't be necessary. Marcus poured his coffee and watched the sky lighten toward sunrise, marking the end of the longest day of his life and the beginning of whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Today, he'd endured. For now, that had to be enough. Morning came too early, pale light filtering through bedroom curtains to find Marcus already awake. He'd slept in fragments, consciousness rising to the surface every hour to remind him that yesterday had actually happened, that it wasn't just another nightmare about traffic stops and weapons drawn and dignity stripped away. He showered methodically, letting hot water pound against shoulders still tight with tension. The routine helped soap, shampoo, shave, each familiar action pulling him back toward himself. In the mirror, his reflection looked older than it had yesterday morning. New lines etched around his eyes, new weight visible in his expression. Downstairs, he made coffee and toast, forcing himself to eat despite having no appetite. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, already showing missed calls and new messages. Rebecca Montgomery, Special Agent Rivera, the Foundation Director. His phone's notification count had climbed past 50 overnight. Marcus addressed the most urgent messages first. A text to Rebecca confirming he'd received Rivera's message and was available for an interview at her convenience. A call to the Foundation explaining his absence and requesting to reschedule the meeting. Each communication required careful consideration of tone and detail, professional, factual, avoiding emotion that might be used against him later. The doorbell rang at 8:30. Marcus checked the security camera feed on his phone before answering. Seeing Evelyn Moss standing on his porch, holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. He opened the door to her concerned smile. "Thought you might need a proper meal," she said, pressing the warm dish into his hands. "And I wanted to give you the original memory card from my doorbell camera. Rebecca said you'd want it for evidence." Marcus accepted both offerings with genuine gratitude. "You didn't have to do this, Evelyn." She waved off the thanks. "We take care of our own on this street. At least, we should?" She paused, her expression troubled. "I'm sorry more of us didn't step up yesterday when it was happening." "You stepped up when it counted." Marcus gestured toward his living room. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" They sat in his living room, the morning sun streaming through west-facing windows. Evelyn settled into an armchair, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and told her story. "I've watched this neighborhood change over 40 years. She stared into her coffee as if reading memories in its surface. "Used to be different, back when my husband and I first moved here. More welcoming, maybe. Or maybe I'm just seeing it differently now." "What changed?" Marcus asked quietly. Evelyn looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "People got comfortable, started seeing this street as something that belonged to them, that they could control. When you moved in 9 years ago, I watched the way some neighbors reacted, the suspicion, the way they'd track your movements. Not everyone, mind you, but enough to notice." "Did anyone say anything specific?" "Patricia Daniels." Evelyn's voice hardened. "She made comments from the start, wondering if you were the right fit for the neighborhood, asking if anyone had checked your background, making these little suggestions at block association meetings about increasing security patrols." Marcus nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "I knew there was tension, but I thought if I just kept my head down, did good work, proved myself reliable." "You did prove yourself," Evelyn set down her mug with emphasis. You've been nothing but a model neighbor. That's what makes this so infuriating. No amount of respectability politics was going to change her mind, because her issue was never about who you were as a person. The conversation stretched on for another hour, Evelyn providing context and history that Marcus had only partially understood. The neighborhood's demographics shifting over the past decade, the quiet resistance to change, the way some residents had weaponized concern for safety to maintain control. When she finally left, Marcus sat alone with his cooling coffee, processing the fuller picture of the community he'd tried so hard to belong to. The careful gardening of his front lawn, the friendly waves to neighbors, the volunteering at local events. All of it an attempt to purchase acceptance that was never actually for sale. His phone rang. Rebecca Montgomery. "Morning, Marcus." Her voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone already deep into work mode. "Special Agent Rivera wants to meet this afternoon at 2. Can you make it to my office?" "I'll be there." "Good. I've received the video files from multiple neighbors now. Evelyn's footage, the Chen family's doorbell camera, even footage from Mr. Patterson's security system. Marcus, this is some of the clearest documentation of police misconduct I've seen in 20 years. What's the timeline looking like?" Rebecca paused, and Marcus could almost hear her choosing words carefully. "The federal investigation will take months, but I'm expecting movement on the local level much faster. I've already filed complaints with the police department's Internal Affairs Division and sent preliminary documentation to the district attorney's office. When they see this video evidence, they're going to understand they can't sweep this under the rug. And the civil suit? That's long-term." Rebecca's voice held grim determination. "We're building a pattern of behavior case not just against the officers, but against the department culture that enabled them. That takes time to develop properly." They discussed logistics for another few minutes before ending the call. Marcus spent the rest of the morning writing out a detailed account of every interaction from yesterday, cross-referencing his timeline with the video timestamps Evelyn had provided. The precision mattered. Dates, times, exact quotes where he could remember them, visual details that could be verified against footage. At 1 o'clock, he changed into a navy suit and conservative tie, armor for the afternoon's meeting. The drive to Rebecca's office took him through downtown, past the courthouse where he'd been arraigned yesterday, past the police station where he'd been processed and photographed and fingerprinted like a criminal. Rebecca's office occupied the 3rd floor of a modern building near the riverfront. Her assistant showed Marcus into a conference room where Rebecca waited with a woman he didn't recognize. Late 40s. Dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a crisp FBI windbreaker over business casual clothing. Marcus Sullivan. Meet Special Agent Monica Rivera. Rebecca made the introduction smoothly. Rivera stood to shake his hand, her grip firm and professional. "Thank you for making time on short notice, Mr. Sullivan. I know this has been a difficult 24 hours. They settled around the conference table, Rivera pulling out a recording device and a legal pad. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about a few things. This is a preliminary interview. Everything you tell me is part of an official federal investigation. I need complete honesty, even about details that might feel embarrassing or irrelevant. Nothing is too small to mention." Marcus nodded his understanding. "Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. What part of Marcus's experience resonates with you most? Share your thoughts in the comments." Rivera started with basic background questions: his employment history, his time in the neighborhood, his reputation in the community. Marcus answered carefully and completely, painting a picture of an established professional with deep local roots and zero criminal history. Then they moved to the incident itself. Rivera's questions were precise and probing, asking for details Marcus hadn't even realized he'd noticed. The exact positioning of the officers' vehicles, the specific words used in each command, the timeline of when weapons were drawn, the body language of bystanders watching the scene unfold. Marcus answered everything, his memory aided by having written it all down that morning. When he described the contradictory commands Turn around. Get down. Don't move. Rivera made a note and circled it. Classic setup, she said quietly. Give conflicting orders, then claim resistance, when the subject can't possibly comply with all of them simultaneously. Rebecca leaned forward. You've seen this pattern before? Rivera's expression hardened. More times than I can count. It's a common tactic among officers who've learned they can manufacture probable cause for arrests. The body camera footage usually tells a different story than the official reports. Except these officers didn't have their cameras on, Rebecca noted. Rivera looked up sharply. They didn't? The interaction happened during duty hours, in a residential area. Involving a civilian stop? Marcus confirmed it. Neither officer activated their cameras until after the handcuffs were on. And even then, the footage only showed me already restrained and compliant. Rivera made another note, this one underlined multiple times. That's a department policy violation that we'll be documenting thoroughly. Conveniently forgotten cameras have become their own red flag. The interview continued for 2 hours. Rivera extracting every detail Marcus could provide about the officer's behavior, the booking process, the charges filed. She asked about Captain Hayes' response, about the prosecutor's approach at arraignment, about Judge Chen's questions from the bench. Finally, she sat back, reviewing her notes. Mr. Sullivan, I want you to understand what we're building here. This isn't just about 2 officers who made bad choices. We're looking at potential patterns of civil rights violations, department culture that enables misconduct, and possible conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. Rebecca interjected. Which means what, exactly, in practical terms? Rivera met her gaze steadily. It means this investigation has resources and attention from very high levels. Your phone calls to Washington got heard, Mr. Sullivan. People in positions of authority are paying attention. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of belief that accountability might actually be possible. What do you need from me going forward? Full cooperation with the investigation. Availability for follow-up interviews. Preservation of all evidence in your possession. And patience. Rivera's expression softened slightly. I know that last one is the hardest. But federal investigations move thoroughly, not quickly. They wrapped up shortly after, Rivera promising to stay in close contact as the investigation progressed. After she left, Marcus remained in the conference room with Rebecca, both of them processing the weight of what had just occurred. This is real, Rebecca said quietly. They're actually building a real case. Marcus nodded, still absorbing it. What happens to Lawson and McBride in the meantime? Rebecca's smile held no warmth. I filed a formal complaint with the department this morning. Internal Affairs will have to respond. And given the federal attention, I'm betting the department puts them on administrative leave while the investigation proceeds. And Patricia Daniels? We sue her separately. Rebecca pulled out a different file. False reporting, malicious prosecution, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're going to make it clear that weaponizing police against your neighbors has consequences. Marcus left Rebecca's office as afternoon faded toward evening, the city's rush-hour traffic beginning to build. He drove home through familiar streets that felt strange now, seeing the infrastructure of law enforcement, patrol cars, precinct stations, courthouse buildings through different eyes. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. An unknown number. Marcus hesitated, then answered. Mr. Sullivan, this is Captain Sharon Hayes from the precinct. I'd like to speak with you about yesterday's incident if you have a moment. Marcus sat in his car, engine still running, weighing his response. I'm represented by counsel, Captain. Any communication should go through my attorney. A pause. I understand. I just wanted to let you know that Officers Lawson and McBride have been placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation, and I wanted to apologize for what you experienced. Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Is this conversation being recorded, Captain? No. Hayes's voice remained professional but carried an undercurrent of something else. Regret, perhaps, or calculation. This is off the record. Then off the record, Captain. Your apology means nothing without systemic change. Administrative leave is what officers get for paid vacations, while departments wait for public attention to move elsewhere. A longer pause. You're right. Hayes sighed audibly. For what it's worth, I'm pushing for more than just leave. But I wanted you to know that some of us inside the department recognize this was wrong. Marcus ended the call without responding further, his jaw tight with anger and exhaustion. Empty apologies from authority figures who'd failed to prevent the abuse in the first place. Promises of accountability that so often evaporated once cameras turned away. He went inside to find another casserole on his doorstep, this one from the Chen family. A note attached read simply, "We stand with you." The next 3 weeks moved with agonizing slowness, punctuated by bursts of intense activity. Marcus established a new routine around the investigation. Morning meetings with Rebecca to review evidence. Afternoon sessions documenting additional details as they surfaced in his memory. Evening phone calls with federal investigators, who seemed to materialize new questions from thin air. The neighborhood transformed around him. Evelyn Moss became an unofficial coordinator, collecting witness statements and video footage from residents who'd been too frightened or uncertain to come forward initially. The Chen family installed additional security cameras and encouraged their neighbors to do the same. Even Mr. Patterson, who'd barely spoken to anyone in years, provided a detailed written account of what he'd witnessed from his front window. Patricia Daniels's house remained dark most days, curtains drawn. Her presence felt only through absence. Rumor on the street said she'd taken an extended visit to relatives out of state. Marcus suspected she'd been advised by her own attorney to maintain a low profile while the investigation unfolded. The media discovered the story in week 2. A local reporter named Tasha Williams, who'd built her career on holding power accountable, somehow obtained copies of the arrest video and aired a segment that sparked immediate public outrage. Within days, the story had jumped from local news to regional coverage to national attention. Marcus's phone became a constant source of interruption, interview requests, support messages, hate mail from people who believed the officer's narrative without question. He screened calls ruthlessly, responding only to official contacts and close friends, letting everything else dissolve into voicemail that he deleted without listening. Rebecca called one morning with news delivered in carefully controlled tones. The district attorney's office dropped all charges this morning. Complete dismissal with prejudice, meaning they can't refile. Marcus absorbed the information without celebration. That's good, but it's not enough. I know. Rebecca's voice carried understanding. Dropping charges is the bare minimum. It doesn't address the underlying violation or provide any compensation for what you endured. What about the officers? Still on administrative leave. Internal Affairs is conducting their investigation in parallel with the federal probe. I'm hearing rumors that the department's worried about the optics of keeping them on payroll much longer. Rumors aren't accountability. Marcus stared out his kitchen window at the street where he'd been arrested, where his professional reputation had been dragged through public mud based on lies. No, they're not. But they're a start. Rebecca paused. There's something else you should know. Special Agent Rivera contacted me yesterday. The investigation has expanded beyond just your arrest. What do you mean? They're looking into patterns. Other stops by these officers. Other complaints that were buried. Other instances of falsified reports. Your case opened a door, Marcus, and now they're finding a whole lot of ugliness behind it. Marcus felt a complex mix of vindication and sorrow. How many other people went through this without video evidence? Without connections to make phone calls that got heard? Without the resources to fight back? Too many. Rebecca's voice hardened with determination. But we're going to use your case to shine a light on all of it. That's how systemic change actually happens, one documented violation at a time, building toward a pattern that can't be ignored. The 4th week brought a break in the case that changed everything. Special Agent Rivera called Marcus directly, her voice carrying barely suppressed excitement. We found something. 3 other arrests by Officer Lawson over the past 18 months, all following the same pattern. Black men in predominantly white neighborhoods, stopped without clear probable cause, given contradictory commands, arrested for resisting when they complied. The video footage tells a very different story than the official reports. Marcus's pulse quickened. So, this was systematic. Systematic and documented, Rivera continued. We also found communications between Lawson and certain community members, including Patricia Daniels, that suggest coordination. Text messages asking about suspicious persons in the neighborhood, followed by patrol increases in specific areas, followed by stops that match discriminatory patterns. That's conspiracy, Marcus said it flatly, watching the legal implications crystallize. Potentially, yes. We're building toward federal civil rights charges, not just administrative discipline. This is serious, Mr. Sullivan. The kind of serious that ends careers and potentially results in prison time. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus allowed himself to feel something like hope. What do you need from me? Keep doing what you're doing, cooperating fully, preserving evidence, making yourself available for testimony when needed. Rivera's tone shifted slightly. And prepare yourself for this to get bigger. When we bring charges, the media attention will intensify. I'm ready. Marcus meant it. Whatever it takes to ensure this doesn't happen to someone else. After the call ended, Marcus sat with the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. His case had become larger than himself, transformed into a vehicle for pursuing justice that might actually produce meaningful change. The arrest that had felt like violation and humiliation had become ammunition against a system that thrived in darkness. Rebecca filed the civil lawsuit in Week 5, naming Officer Lawson, Officer McBride, Patricia Daniels, and the entire police department as defendants. The complaint ran to 47 pages, meticulously detailing the arrest, the constitutional violations, the emotional and professional damages, and the pattern of behavior that enabled the abuse. The local news covered the filing extensively. Tasha Williams devoted a full segment to reading key passages from the complaint, her voice carrying righteous anger as she detailed the officer's actions. Public opinion began to shift noticeably, where initial coverage had been balanced between competing narratives. The accumulation of evidence tilted perception toward recognition that Marcus had been wronged. Not everyone agreed, of course. Marcus received letters and emails from people convinced he must have done something to provoke the arrest, that no officer would abuse their authority without cause, that the video evidence was somehow manipulated or taken out of context. He read these messages with a mix of sadness and recognition. Denial ran deep when challenging worldviews built on trust in authority. But support outweighed criticism. Community organizations reached out, offering platforms to speak about his experience. Fellow nonprofit directors coordinated to ensure his programs continued despite the disruption. Colleagues testified to his character, his professionalism, his years of community service. The Foundation Board, which had been cautious initially, issued a public statement backing Marcus completely and condemning the arrest as racial profiling. They rescheduled the funding meeting and approved the youth mentorship program unanimously, adding additional resources to account for the time Marcus had lost dealing with legal proceedings. In Week 6, the internal affairs investigation concluded. Rebecca called to deliver the news with grim satisfaction in her voice. Both officers are being terminated. The department just issued the announcement. Lawson and McBride have been fired for policy violations, filing false reports, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Marcus absorbed this quietly. Will they lose their certifications? The state licensing board is reviewing the case. Given the evidence and the federal investigation, Rebecca sounded confident. I'd say decertification is highly likely. They won't be able to just move to another department and continue their behavior. A small victory, then. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not enough, but something. There's more. Rebecca's tone shifted. Captain Hayes resigned this morning. Her statement cited wanting to allow new leadership to address department culture. Forced resignation? Marcus guessed. Almost certainly. The federal investigation found that she'd been made aware of multiple complaints about Lawson's behavior and failed to take action. Her resignation lets her save face while removing an administrator who enabled the problem. Marcus thought about Hayes' off-the-record phone call, her empty apology, her claimed desire for change. Actions spoke louder than words, and her action had been to protect officers who violated civil rights until federal pressure made their behavior impossible to ignore. "What about the district attorney?" Marcus asked. Webb prosecuted charges he had to know were baseless. Rebecca paused. "That's trickier. Prosecutors have broad immunity for charging decisions. But the state bar is reviewing his conduct, filing charges without probable cause, proceeding despite video evidence contradicting the officer's statements. There might be enough for ethics violations, even if criminal charges aren't possible." The conversation shifted to next steps in the civil suit discovery timelines, deposition schedules, the likely path toward either settlement or trial. Marcus half listened, his mind already moving ahead to the larger implications. "I want to use this," he said suddenly. "The platform, the attention. I want to use it to build something that prevents this from happening to others." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "What did you have in mind?" "A community oversight board with real power. Training programs for documenting police encounters. Legal resources for people who can't afford to fight back." Marcus's voice grew stronger as the vision crystallified. "Everything I learned from going through this, turned into infrastructure that protects the next person. That's ambitious." Rebecca didn't sound skeptical, if anything. Her tone carried approval. "And exactly the kind of thing that transforms a lawsuit from being about money into being about meaningful change. What do you think a community needs most when facing this kind of systemic problem? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below." They ended the call with Rebecca promising to connect Marcus with community organizers and civil rights attorneys who'd built similar programs in other cities. Marcus spent the rest of the day researching existing oversight models, making notes, sketching out frameworks for what effective accountability might actually look like. His phone rang that evening. "Anthony, turn on the news. Channel 7. Marcus switched on his television to find a press conference in progress. Special Agent Rivera stood behind a podium bearing the FBI seal, flanked by other federal officials he didn't recognize. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Federal charges filed in civil rights case." Rivera's voice carried through the speakers with official gravity. "Today, the United States Department of Justice is filing federal criminal charges against former police officers Derek Lawson and Travis McBride for deprivation of rights, under color of law, conspiracy against rights, and filing false statements in connection with their arrest of Marcus Sullivan on October 8th. Marcus sat down heavily, the weight of the moment settling over him like snow accumulating on branches. Rivera continued, "These charges stem from a pattern of discriminatory enforcement targeting black residents in predominantly white neighborhoods. The evidence shows systematic violation of constitutional rights, abuse of police authority, and deliberate falsification of reports to conceal misconduct." The camera cut to questions from reporters. Rivera fielded them with professional precision, declining to discuss specific evidence, but confirming that the investigation had uncovered multiple victims beyond Marcus's case. "This prosecution represents the department's commitment to holding law enforcement accountable when they violate the very laws they're sworn to uphold," Rivera concluded. "No one is above the law. No badge provides immunity from consequences when rights are trampled." The press conference ended. Marcus sat in silence, his television still playing but his mind elsewhere, back on that October morning, back to the moment when weapons were drawn and dignity was stripped away, back to the cold certainty that compliance might not be enough to keep him alive. Now those officers faced federal criminal charges. Now the system that had failed him was, slowly and imperfectly, attempting to correct itself. The satisfaction felt muted, tempered by knowledge of how many others had endured similar violations without video evidence, without community support, without the resources and connections that had made his fight possible. His phone erupted with calls and messages, reporters seeking comment, Supporters offering congratulations, colleagues expressing vindication. Marcus ignored most of them, responding only to Rebecca with a simple text. "Thank you for everything." Her response came quickly. "We're not done yet, but this is a good day." Marcus thought about that as night fell over his quiet street. A good day. Not a perfect day, not a day that erased what had been done to him, but a day that moved the needle toward accountability. A day that said violations had consequences. A day that might make the next officer think twice before manufacturing charges against an innocent person. He stood at his front window, looking out at the neighborhood that had been the site of his violation and was slowly becoming the site of his vindication. Porch lights glowed warm against the autumn darkness. Somewhere down the street, he could hear children playing a last game before bedtime. Life continued, ordinary and extraordinary, all at once. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, depositions to prepare for, community meetings to organize, systems to build that might prevent the next Marcus Sullivan from having to fight this battle alone. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply breathe, to feel the solid floor beneath his feet, to exist in a moment where justice, however imperfect, was actually being pursued. He thought about calling Anthony, or Rebecca, or Evelyn. Instead, he made himself a simple dinner, ate it slowly in his quiet kitchen, and went to bed earlier than usual. The exhaustion of 6 weeks' sustained crisis finally caught up with him, and for the first time since October 8th, Marcus slept through the night without waking. Winter arrived early that year, November bringing frost that silvered the lawns and transformed morning breath into visible clouds. Marcus adapted to his new normal mornings dedicated to his nonprofit work, afternoons consumed by legal proceedings, evenings spent building the community accountability infrastructure he'd envisioned. The civil suit moved through discovery with glacial inevitability. Depositions revealed patterns even uglier than the initial investigation had uncovered. Officer Lawson had a history of complaints stretching back 5 years, each one dismissed or buried by departmental bureaucracy designed to protect its own. Officer McBride was newer to the force, but had quickly learned that aggressive enforcement in certain neighborhoods earned commendations rather than criticism. Patricia Daniels's deposition was particularly revealing. Under oath, and faced with video evidence contradicting her claims, her story fell apart in real time. She'd called in the suspicious person report not because Marcus had done anything concerning, but because she'd decided his presence in the neighborhood decreased property values and made her feel uncomfortable. The weaponization of police had been deliberate, calculated, malicious. Rebecca played the recording for Marcus afterward, her expression grim. "This is what we needed." Her own words, demonstrating intent to use police as a tool of harassment. Marcus listened to Patricia's testimony, her voice defensive, her explanations thin, her casual cruelty laid bare for the legal record. He felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness at how easily fear could be transformed into violence when given official sanction. The federal criminal case moved faster than most expected. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence, video from multiple angles, testimony from numerous witnesses, documentation of pattern and practice, communications establishing coordination. Lawson and McBride's defense attorneys floated various theories, but none could overcome the clear record of constitutional violations. In mid-December, both former officers accepted plea agreements rather than face trial. Lawson pled guilty to deprivation of rights and filing false statements, receiving a 3-year federal prison sentence and permanent prohibition from law enforcement. McBride, characterized as following his partner's lead, received 18 months and the same prohibition from police work. Special Agent Rivera called Marcus personally to inform him of the plea agreements. "These sentences matter," she said firmly. "They establish that civil rights violations have real consequences. Every officer who hears about this case will understand that abuse of authority can mean federal prison." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, even as he recognized its limitations. Some officers would learn the lesson. Others would simply become more careful about avoiding video evidence. Meaningful change required more than deterrence through punishment. It required transformation of the culture that enabled abuse in the first place, which brought him back to the community oversight project that had consumed his evenings. Working with Evelyn Moss, Thomas Garrett, the Chen family, and other committed neighbors, Marcus had developed a comprehensive framework for civilian accountability. The plan included documentation protocols, legal resource networks, rapid response teams, and most importantly, formal oversight mechanisms with genuine enforcement power. They presented the proposal to the City Council on a Tuesday evening in late December. The council chamber was packed community members who'd suffered their own encounters with problematic policing, activists who'd been pushing for reform for years, journalists documenting what might become a watershed moment in local governance. Marcus stood at the podium, his navy suit pressed and his voice steady, and laid out the case for change. He spoke about his arrest not as personal grievance, but as symptom of systemic failure. He detailed the patterns the federal investigation had uncovered. He explained how proper oversight could have prevented not just his violation, but dozens of others. This isn't about hating police, he concluded, making eye contact with council members. This is about creating systems that make good policing possible and bad policing impossible. This is about ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else in this city. The council voted 5-2 in favor of establishing a civilian oversight board with subpoena power and independent investigative authority. Not everything Marcus had requested, but enough to matter, enough to build on. Rebecca was waiting outside the council chamber afterward, her smile genuine and warm. You're building something real here. Not just winning your case, but changing the system. Marcus shook his head slightly. Winning would mean it never happened. This is just making sure my violation accomplishes something beyond personal vindication. The civil suit reached settlement negotiations in January. The city's attorneys, faced with overwhelming evidence and mounting legal costs, proposed a 7-figure settlement, including admission of wrongdoing and commitment to implementing the oversight recommendations. Rebecca brought the offer to Marcus in her office, laying out the terms with professional precision. The money is substantial, she said carefully. Enough to compensate for what you endured, and then some. But more importantly, they're agreeing to structural changes oversight board, body camera requirements, complaint review processes, all of it. Marcus reviewed the settlement documents, seeing his October morning translated into legalese and dollar figures. What about Patricia Daniels? Separate settlement still being negotiated. Rebecca's expression hardened. But I've made clear we won't drop that suit without significant compensation and public acknowledgement of her false reporting. The settlement finalized in early February. Marcus stood alongside Rebecca at another press conference, this one announcing the resolution of his civil suit. The media coverage was extensive, reporters dissecting every element of the agreement and what it meant for police accountability more broadly. This settlement represents more than money, Marcus told the assembled journalists. It represents a commitment to change. The city has agreed to implement comprehensive oversight mechanisms that will protect future residents from the kind of violation I experienced. Questions came rapid fire. Would he consider the matter resolved? Did he forgive the officers? What message did he have for other victims of police misconduct? Marcus answered carefully and honestly. Resolution isn't the same as healing. The officers will serve their federal sentences, but no amount of prison time erases what happened. As for forgiveness, he paused, choosing words with precision. That's a personal journey I'm still on. What I can say is that I'm committed to ensuring accountability and preventing future harm. The press conference ended. Marcus and Rebecca left through a side exit to avoid the crowd of reporters still shouting questions. In the parking garage, Marcus leaned against Rebecca's car and allowed himself a moment of exhaustion. You okay? Rebecca asked gently. I'm tired. Marcus looked at her with complete honesty. Tired of being angry. Tired of reliving that morning every time I give an interview or review evidence. Tired of being the poster child for police reform. You're allowed to be tired. Rebecca's voice carried understanding. You've been fighting this battle for 4 months straight, while still running your nonprofit and dealing with trauma. Anyone would be exhausted. Marcus nodded, grateful for the permission to acknowledge his weariness. The victory felt hollow in some ways. Yes, he'd won accountability. Yes, the system had responded. Yes, structural changes were being implemented. But none of it brought back the innocence of that October morning. The belief that compliance provided safety, the trust in institutions designed to serve and protect. The Community Oversight Board held its first official meeting in March. Marcus attended as an observer rather than participant, recognizing that effective oversight required independence from the cases that had sparked its creation. He watched as community members, civil rights attorneys, and former law enforcement officers who believed in accountability gathered to establish protocols and procedures. Evelyn Moss had been appointed to the board, her documentation of Marcus's arrest having established her as someone who understood the importance of evidence preservation. She sat at the conference table with 7 other members, her weathered hands steady as she reviewed proposed bylaws and enforcement mechanisms. The first case the board reviewed involved a traffic stop that had escalated unnecessarily. A young woman pulled over for a minor violation and subjected to aggressive questioning that went far beyond the scope of the alleged infraction. The body camera footage showed behavior that, while not rising to criminal conduct, demonstrated exactly the kind of unnecessary escalation the Oversight Board existed to address. The board voted to recommend additional training for the officers involved and revision of traffic stop protocols to prevent similar escalation. Small changes, incremental improvements, but changes nonetheless. Marcus watched from the gallery and allowed himself to believe that maybe, slowly, things actually could get better. Spring brought cherry blossoms and longer days, and a sense of life renewing itself. Marcus returned to his routine at the nonprofit, the youth mentorship program finally launching after months of delay. The first cohort of young people, 15 teenagers from underserved neighborhoods, gathered for their initial orientation session. Marcus looked at their faces, seeing hope and skepticism, and the complicated mixture of optimism and wariness that comes from growing up, navigating systems that don't always value your humanity. He thought about what to tell them, how to prepare them for a world that might treat them with suspicion despite their innocence. In the end, he told them his story. Not the sanitized version that appeared in news coverage, but the raw truth of that October morning. The fear when guns were drawn, the humiliation of handcuffs on a public street, the exhausting work of pursuing accountability, and ultimately, the power of documentation, community support, and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. The students listened with rapt attention. When he finished, a young man in the back row raised his hand. "How did you stay calm?" he asked. "When they were treating you like that, how did you not fight back?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Staying calm wasn't about accepting their treatment. It was about surviving the moment so I could fight back later with tools that actually work: evidence, legal process, community organizing. Physical resistance in that situation would have given them exactly the excuse they wanted to escalate violence. Another student spoke up, a young woman whose expression held skepticism born from experience. "But you had connections, right? Phone calls you could make that regular people can't. What about us?" "That's why we built the Oversight Board," Marcus replied. "That's why we created documentation protocols and rapid response networks, so that the next person who faces what I faced doesn't have to depend on personal connections to get justice. The system should protect everyone equally." He didn't know if they believed him, didn't know if he fully believed it himself. But he knew that building those protections was worth the effort, even if they remained imperfect, even if they didn't catch every violation, even if progress came slower than justice demanded. The mentorship program became Marcus's focus as spring turned to summer. Working with the teenagers, helping them develop leadership skills and navigate institutional systems, provided purpose beyond his own case. He poured energy into creating the support structure he wished had existed for every young person trying to find their way in a society that often saw them as threats before recognizing them as human beings. In June, Patricia Daniels's civil case finally settled. The terms were confidential, but Rebecca's satisfied expression told Marcus everything he needed to know. She'd extracted significant compensation and, more importantly, secured a public apology acknowledging the false report and its consequences. The apology was brief and clearly written by attorneys, but it existed on the public record, a permanent admission that Patricia's call had been motivated by bias rather than legitimate concern. She'd moved out of the neighborhood months earlier, her house sold to a young mixed-race couple who'd been warmly welcomed by neighbors who'd learned something from watching Marcus's fight. Summer brought the one-year anniversary of plans that Marcus had never quite shelved, the foundation meeting that had been interrupted by his arrest, the youth program that had been delayed but ultimately implemented, the community work that had continued despite attempts to criminalize his very existence. He marked the anniversary quietly, without fanfare. A morning walk down his street, past the sidewalk where his briefcase had fallen, past Evelyn's house where she'd recorded the evidence that made accountability possible, past the spot where he'd been forced to his knees on cold pavement. The street looked the same: neat lawns, American flags, bicycles scattered on driveways. But something fundamental had shifted. Neighbors who'd hidden behind curtains now waved from porches. The community that had been complacent had become at least partially awakened. The systems that had enabled abuse now faced oversight and accountability. Not perfect, not anywhere close to perfect, but better than before, and that had to count for something. The second autumn after his arrest arrived with familiar rituals: leaves turning gold and crimson, morning frost giving way to afternoon warmth, the smell of wood smoke drifting through neighborhoods preparing for winter. Marcus stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, watching his street wake up to another Wednesday morning. So much had changed. So much remained the same. The Oversight Board had completed its first full year of operation, reviewing 43 cases and issuing recommendations that ranged from additional training to formal discipline. Not every recommendation had been implemented. Bureaucracy moved slowly. Resistance to change ran deep. But the mere existence of civilian review had shifted dynamics, made officers more cautious, gave citizens somewhere to turn when encounters went wrong. The youth mentorship program had expanded to serve 50 teenagers across 3 cohorts. Marcus watched his students navigate systems with tools he'd helped provide: documentation skills, legal awareness, community networks that responded when young people faced unjust treatment. 2 of his first cohort had been accepted to competitive universities. Several others had become peer leaders, teaching younger students how to protect themselves through knowledge rather than confrontation. Rebecca had filed 6 more civil rights lawsuits on behalf of clients who'd experienced similar violations, each one building on the precedent Marcus's case had established. The police department, facing mounting legal costs and federal oversight, had begun implementing genuine reforms: implicit bias training, de-escalation protocols, body camera policies with actual enforcement mechanisms. Progress. Incremental, insufficient, but real. Marcus's nonprofit had received national recognition for its work, grants, and awards, acknowledging the impact of programs that treated young people as assets rather than threats. He'd been invited to speak at conferences, to consult with other cities developing oversight mechanisms, to share lessons learned from transforming personal violation into systemic change. The attention was gratifying and exhausting in equal measure. Every speech required revisiting that October morning. Every interview meant reliving the fear and humiliation. Every consultation demanded emotional labor of explaining trauma to audiences who might or might not truly understand. Marcus did it anyway, recognizing that his platform carried responsibility. But he'd also learned to protect his own well-being. Therapy sessions every Thursday afternoon, working through PTSD symptoms that still manifested in unexpected moments. The sound of car doors slamming, the sight of police cruisers, the feeling of hands gripping his arms. The trauma didn't disappear because justice had been served. Healing moved on its own timeline, separate from legal victories and systemic reforms. Anthony remained his anchor through it all, checking in regularly, providing the kind of support that didn't need words. They'd established a standing Sunday dinner tradition, a sacred space where Marcus could be his brother rather than a symbol, where conversation wandered toward family gossip and sports scores and ordinary concerns that had nothing to do with civil rights or police accountability. Evelyn Moss had become something like a friend, their shared experience of that October morning, creating a bond that transcended generational differences. They met for coffee monthly, conversations ranging from oversight board updates to gardening tips to philosophical discussions about justice and mercy and what forgiveness actually meant. "I still struggle with forgiving Patricia," Marcus admitted, one October afternoon, sitting in Evelyn's kitchen surrounded by the warmth of homemade cookies and afternoon sunlight. The officers at least faced consequences. She got to slink away with minimal accountability. Evelyn poured more coffee, her movements measured and thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about them, honey. It's about you deciding you're not going to let their actions continue poisoning your life." Marcus considered this, turning the mug between his hands. "I don't want revenge. I just want acknowledgement that what she did was evil. That calling police on an innocent black man wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to harm someone she saw as not belonging in her neighborhood." She settled back. "You've built something that prevents the next Patricia from wielding that kind of power so easily. The oversight mechanisms, the documentation protocols, the community solidarity, those are your answer to her cruelty. Sometimes that has to be enough." The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but Marcus carried Evelyn's words with him as autumn deepened toward winter. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best response to malice was building systems that prevented malice from finding purchase. The police department announced a new chief in November, hired from outside the city, specifically to implement reforms. Chief Michaela Torres came with a reputation for holding officers accountable and prioritizing community relationships over warrior mentality. Her first official act was attending an oversight board meeting, listening more than speaking, acknowledging past failures without making defensive excuses. Marcus watched from the gallery, assessing this new leadership with cautious skepticism earned through hard experience. Words were easy. Actions would tell whether actual change was possible. Chief Torres proved herself through small but significant actions over the following months. Officers who violated body camera policies faced immediate discipline. Complaint processes became genuinely transparent, rather than bureaucratic labyrinths designed to exhaust complainants. Training curricula were revised to emphasize de-escalation and implicit bias recognition. Not perfect. The department still had officers who resisted reform, who saw accountability as attack, who longed for the days when their authority went unquestioned. But the culture was shifting, slowly, toward recognition that serving the community meant actually serving all its members. In December, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. Officer Derek Lawson, calling from federal prison. He debated whether to accept the call. Curiosity won out over caution. "Yes, Mr. Sullivan." Lawson's voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the aggressive confidence that had characterized their original encounter. "I know you have no reason to listen to me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry." Marcus said nothing, waiting. "What I did to you was wrong. The arrest, the false charges, treating you like you were less than human. All of it was wrong. I've had a lot of time to think about my choices and the harm I caused. I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm genuinely sorry." Marcus absorbed this, testing the apology for sincerity. "What prompted this call?" "My attorney recommended I not contact you. Said it could complicate things legally." Lawson paused. "But I've been sitting here thinking about all the lives I damaged, and I realized I needed to at least try to make amends. Even if you hang up on me, even if you tell me to go to hell, I needed to say it." Marcus looked out his window at the winter afternoon, gray clouds promising snow. "What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Absolution? I don't deserve either." Lawson's voice cracked slightly. I just wanted you to know that prison isn't the only punishment I'm living with. Knowing what I did, who I was, that's harder than any sentence a judge could impose." They spoke for another 10 minutes, Marcus asking questions that Lawson answered with what seemed like genuine remorse. About his training, about department culture, about the incremental steps that led from wanting to be a good officer to abusing his authority, about learning to see people like Marcus as threats rather than human beings deserving respect. When someone who harmed you expresses genuine remorse, how do you respond? Does accountability require forgiveness, or are they separate processes? Share your thoughts in the comments. Finally, Marcus spoke the truth he discovered through his own therapy. "I appreciate you calling. I don't know if I can forgive you, that's a process I'm still working through. But I acknowledge that people can change, and I hope you're genuinely becoming someone different than who you were that October morning." After the call ended, Marcus sat with complicated emotions. Anger at what had been done to him remained, legitimate and justified. But hearing Lawson's remorse, recognizing the human capacity for growth, even in people who'd caused harm, that added layers of complexity to a situation he'd previously seen in stark terms of victim and perpetrator. He called Rebecca to discuss the contact. She listened carefully, then offered her perspective. Remorse is good, but it doesn't undo harm. Whether you choose to forgive him is entirely your decision and doesn't affect the legal consequences he faces. Rebecca paused. That said, I've seen how carrying anger corrodes people from the inside. If forgiveness helps you heal, pursue it. If you need to hold on to your anger to feel safe, that's valid too. Christmas brought unexpected joy. The Youth Mentorship Program held its first alumni reunion, former students returning to share their college experiences and career paths, and lives shaped partly by the skills and support Marcus had helped provide. He listened to their stories with pride and recognition that maybe, despite everything, he'd managed to build something valuable from the wreckage of that October morning. One young woman, Jasmine, pulled him aside after the formal program. "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to know something. When I first joined this program, I was so angry all the time. Angry at teachers who saw me as a problem. Angry at security guards who followed me in stores. Angry at a system that treated me like a criminal before I'd done anything wrong. I understand that anger," Marcus said quietly. "I know you do." Jasmine smiled. "But you taught me how to channel it into action, rather than letting it destroy me. You showed me that justice is possible even when it takes work, that accountability exists even when you have to fight for it. You changed my life by refusing to let them break yours." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. He hugged this young woman who represented hope and resilience, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the next generation would face fewer barriers than his own had navigated. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came the second anniversary of his arrest. Marcus marked it differently this time, not with quiet reflection, but with a community celebration at the park near his house. The Oversight Board co-sponsored the event, transforming the anniversary from commemoration of violation into celebration of accountability and systemic change. Hundreds attended, community members who'd supported Marcus through his legal battle, young people from the mentorship program, fellow activists who'd been fighting for police reform long before his case had provided momentum, even some police officers who genuinely believed in the reforms being implemented. Marcus stood at the podium as afternoon sun warmed the gathering, his voice steady and clear. 2 years ago, I was arrested on my own street for the crime of walking while black. That violation could have destroyed me. Instead, with community support and legal advocacy and determination to transform pain into purpose, it became a catalyst for change. He gestured to the crowd. This celebration isn't about me. It's about what happens when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, when neighbors document rather than hide, when attorneys fight for right rather than accept wrong, when community members demand accountability and build systems to enforce it. The speech continued, Marcus laying out what had been accomplished: criminal convictions, civil settlements, oversight mechanisms, cultural shifts within the police department. But he also acknowledged what remained undone, disparities that persisted, communities still over-policed, young people still subjected to suspicion rather than support. "We've made progress," he concluded. "But progress isn't victory. Victory requires continuing this work until no one else has to experience what I went through. Until no parent has to teach their children how to survive encounters with people sworn to protect them. Until the promise of equal justice actually becomes reality." The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus stepped back from the podium, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of everything these 2 years had held: the trauma and the triumph, the violation and the vindication, the personal cost and the systemic impact. Rebecca appeared at his side, her expression warm with understanding. "You okay?" "Yeah." Marcus breathed deeply, grounding himself in the moment. "Yeah, I think I actually am." They stood together, watching the celebration, children playing on playground equipment, while adults networked and organized and built the relationships that made community accountability possible. Music played from speakers someone had set up. Food trucks served free meals, funded by grants Marcus's nonprofit had secured. It felt like hope made tangible, like possibility given form. Anthony found him as the event was winding down, his smile genuine and proud. "Mom and Dad would be proud of you," he said quietly, invoking their parents who'd passed years earlier. "They raised you to stand up for what's right, to not accept injustice lying down. You honored them by fighting this battle." Marcus felt emotion tighten his throat. I wish they could have seen this. The community coming together, the systems changing, the next generation being equipped to fight their own battles. They see it. Anthony's voice carried absolute certainty. And they're proud. As evening approached and the crowd dispersed, Marcus found himself standing in the park alone, watching the last families pack up their belongings and head home. The past 2 years had transformed him in ways both terrible and profound. He'd learned what it meant to have fundamental rights violated. He'd discovered reservoirs of strength he hadn't known he possessed. He'd witnessed community solidarity that restored faith in human decency. Most importantly, he'd learned that justice, while elusive and imperfect, remained possible for those willing to pursue it with relentless determination. The street lights flickered on as Marcus finally headed home, walking the same route he'd taken that October morning 2 years earlier. His briefcase held different documents, now program evaluations instead of grant proposals, oversight reports instead of funding applications. But the walk itself felt reclaimed, transformed from site of violation into pathway toward home. 3 years after the arrest that nearly broke him, Marcus Sullivan stood in the conference room of his nonprofit's new headquarters, preparing for the biggest presentation of his career. Representatives from 12 cities had traveled to learn about the community accountability model that had emerged from his violation and subsequent fight for justice. The room buzzed with conversation as officials, activists, and community organizers found seats around the large oval table. Marcus recognized some faces from conferences and consultations, people who'd been fighting similar battles in their own jurisdictions, people who saw his case as a roadmap for achieving what often seemed impossible. Rebecca Montgomery sat near the back, no longer his attorney but a trusted advisor and friend. Evelyn Moss occupied a seat at the table itself, invited to share her perspective on the power of citizen documentation. Chief Torres was present too, willing to discuss what departmental reform looked like from inside the institution being reformed. Marcus began by telling his story one more time, the narrative polished through countless retellings, but still carrying emotional weight. He walked them through that October morning, the arrest, the legal battle, the federal charges, the civil settlement. But more importantly, he detailed what came after the systems built, the oversight established, the cultural shifts achieved through persistent community pressure. The presentation lasted 2 hours, covering documentation protocols, rapid response networks, oversight mechanisms, legal aid infrastructure, and youth education programs. Marcus shared victories and setbacks with equal honesty, refusing to sugarcoat the difficulty of changing entrenched systems. During the question period, a city council member from a western state raised her hand. "Mr. Sullivan, this all sounds amazing in theory, but how do you sustain this kind of community engagement over years? How do you prevent burnout?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "You build systems that don't depend on any single person's energy or attention. The Oversight Board has rotating membership to prevent fatigue. The documentation network is distributed across dozens of trained volunteers. The Legal Aid Fund has professional staff handling case management. My role has shifted from being the face of reform to being one voice among many." Another participant, a community organizer from the South, followed up. "What about pushback from police unions and resistant officers? How do you overcome institutional opposition?" "You acknowledge it exists and work around it where necessary. Work through it where possible." Marcus glanced at Chief Torres, who nodded permission for him to continue. "We were fortunate to get new leadership committed to reform. That's not always possible. But even with resistant leadership, civilian oversight with real enforcement power can still accomplish meaningful change. It just takes longer and requires more community pressure." The discussion continued, participants sharing their own challenges and learning from each other's experiences. Marcus watched relationships forming across the table, networks being established that would outlast this single meeting. This was how change actually happened, not through individual heroes, but through collective action sustained over time. During a break, Evelyn pulled Marcus aside. "You've come a long way from that man who stood frozen on the sidewalk with guns pointed at him." Marcus smiled, though the memory still carried sting. "Sometimes I don't recognize that version of myself anymore. The person I was before the arrest, he had this faith in systems, this belief that doing everything right would protect him. I can't get that innocence back." Evelyn's expression held understanding and compassion. "No, you can't. But you've built something more valuable than innocence: knowledge, tools, infrastructure that protects others. That matters more than one person's lost faith." The afternoon session focused on sustainability and scaling. Marcus presented financial models for funding oversight boards, recruitment strategies for maintaining community engagement, training curricula for educating citizens about their rights and documentation responsibilities. Everything grounded in practical experience rather than theoretical ideals. As the presentation concluded, a young activist approached Marcus, a black woman in her 20s, whose intensity reminded him of his younger self. "Mr. Sullivan, I experienced something similar to your arrest 2 years ago in my city. We tried to fight it, but we didn't have the resources, or the evidence, or the community support. The charges were dropped, but nothing changed. How do I prevent giving up?" Marcus recognized the exhaustion in her eyes, the corrosive effect of fighting battles that seemed unwinnable. "First, acknowledge that one person can't change entire systems alone. Find allies, attorneys who do civil rights work, community organizations already fighting for accountability, even sympathetic officials within institutions. Build networks before you need them." "But what if the video doesn't exist? What if witnesses don't come forward? What if the system just swallows everything like it never happened?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Then you document everything you can, and you keep fighting anyway, knowing that sometimes justice takes years to arrive." Marcus spoke from hard-won experience. "My case had video evidence from multiple angles, federal connections that made departments pay attention, an attorney who believed in the fight. Most people don't have those advantages. That's why building infrastructure matters, so the next person has resources I was lucky to access." The young woman nodded, tears visible in her eyes. "Thank you for not pretending it's easy, for acknowledging the barriers while still insisting change is possible." After everyone departed, Marcus stood alone in the conference room, looking at the materials scattered across the table: handouts, contact lists, resource guides, everything needed to replicate the model his community had developed. He thought about the journey from that October morning to this moment, the transformation of personal violation into systemic impact. His phone buzzed. A text from Anthony. Saw your presentation trending on social media. Mom and Dad would be so proud. I know I am. Marcus smiled, pocketing his phone and beginning to clean up. The work continued. Oversight board meetings to attend, mentorship sessions to facilitate, consultations with other cities to conduct. The fight for accountability was never truly finished, only sustained through persistent effort. But tonight, he would go home to his house on the street where he'd been arrested, would sleep in the bed he'd bought before violation had taught him how fragile safety actually was, would wake tomorrow and choose again to turn pain into purpose. The drive home took him through the city he'd called home for over a decade, familiar streets now layered with memories both terrible and transformative. He passed the courthouse, where Judge Chen had questioned the prosecution's weak case, the police station, where he'd been processed and photographed, the park where community celebration had marked the second anniversary of his arrest. As he turned onto his own street, Marcus noted changes that had accumulated over 3 years. New families and houses that had sat empty, children's toys scattered across lawns, American flags hanging alongside Black Lives Matter banners, a visible statement that patriotism and demands for justice need not be contradictory. Evelyn waved from her porch, her presence a constant reminder of the neighbor who'd chosen documentation over silence. Marcus waved back, pulling into his own driveway and sitting for a moment before going inside. He thought about Officer Lawson's phone call from prison, about the complicated reality that people who cause harm can still experience genuine remorse, about Patricia Daniels, whose malicious report had set everything in motion, and who'd faced far less accountability than the officers who'd acted on her lie, about Chief Torres and the officers genuinely trying to reform department culture from within. Justice was messy, incomplete, frustratingly slow. But it was also possible, achievable, worth fighting for, despite the personal cost. Inside his house, Marcus changed out of his presentation suit and into comfortable clothes. He made himself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and vegetables, and ate slowly while reading emails from the day's participants. Follow-up questions, requests for additional resources, invitations to consult with their communities. The work multiplied even as it succeeded, each victory creating opportunities for broader impact, while demanding more energy and attention. Marcus had learned to set boundaries, to protect his own well-being, while still showing up for the collective fight. Therapy helped. So did Anthony's insistence on regular family time. So did the mentorship program, which grounded his work in young faces, representing hope for better futures. Later that evening, Marcus stood at his front window, the same spot where he'd stood countless times over the years. The street lay quiet under streetlights, peaceful in a way that no longer felt entirely trustworthy, but no longer inspired active fear either. He thought about the question that participant had asked: how to sustain engagement, how to prevent burnout. The honest answer was that sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes the weight became too heavy, the progress too slow, the setbacks too discouraging. Sometimes you needed to step back, to rest, to let others carry the work forward while you recovered your strength. But you also kept showing up, kept building systems, kept transforming personal pain into collective protection. Because the alternative, accepting injustice as inevitable, allowing violations to disappear into bureaucratic silence, letting fear win, that was no alternative at all. Marcus's phone rang. Rebecca. How'd it go? Better than expected. Marcus settled into his favorite chair. People were genuinely engaged, asked good questions, left with concrete tools they can use. I think we're actually building something that might outlast us. That's the goal. Rebecca's voice carried satisfaction. Individual cases matter, but systemic change is what prevents the next case from happening. They talked for another 20 minutes about upcoming projects, potential collaborations, the slow, grinding work of accountability. When the call ended, Marcus sat in the quiet of his home, feeling the weight of 3 years' struggle and triumph settle into something approaching peace. He'd never forget that October morning, the guns drawn, the handcuffs biting into wrists, the humiliation of being arrested on his own street for the crime of existing. The violation had left scars that therapy helped manage, but couldn't erase. Some nights he still woke from nightmares featuring flashing lights and shouted commands. But he'd also discovered strength he hadn't known he possessed. Community solidarity that transcended comfortable silence. The power of documentation and legal advocacy and persistent pressure applied to systems designed to resist change. The possibility that one person's fight could create tools that protected countless others. Marcus stood and walked to his home office, where framed newspaper articles documented the journey from arrest to accountability. Headlines tracking the federal charges, the civil settlement, the establishment of oversight mechanisms. Photographs of the community celebration, the mentorship program, the presentation he'd given today. A life transformed by violation and by the choice to fight back with every tool available. Not perfect, he'd lost things that could never be recovered, paid costs that felt unfair and excessive, but meaningful, purposeful, directed toward preventing the next Marcus Sullivan from facing the same battle alone. He thought about forgiveness for Lawson, for McBride, for Patricia Daniels, for the system that had enabled their abuse. Some days forgiveness felt possible, a releasing of anger that served primarily to corrode his own spirit. Other days, it felt like surrender, like accepting that what had been done to him was somehow forgivable. Maybe both were true. Maybe forgiveness existed not as single moment, but as ongoing process, choosing daily to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than revenge, to transform rather than simply condemn. Marcus returned to his front window one last time before bed, looking out at the street that had been site of violation and was slowly becoming site of vindication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: oversight board meeting in the morning, mentorship session in the afternoon, consultation call with another city in the evening. But tonight, he was simply Marcus Sullivan, a man who'd survived, who'd fought back, who'd built something meaningful from the wreckage of one terrible October morning. A man who'd learned that justice, while imperfect and incomplete, remained possible for those willing to pursue it with relentless determination. He closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to bed with the quiet knowledge that he'd done everything he could to ensure his violation accomplished something beyond personal suffering. Whether it was enough remained to be seen, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all you could ask for. The street outside settled into silence, porch lights glowing warm against the autumn darkness. Life continued its ordinary rhythms, people sleeping, children dreaming, neighbors existing in the fragile piece of community that required constant maintenance and could never be taken for granted. And in one house on that street, a man who'd been broken by injustice and had rebuilt himself through fighting for accountability finally rested, knowing that tomorrow he'd wake up and choose again to turn pain into purpose, violation into vindication, personal suffering into systemic protection. The work continued, the fight persisted, and sometimes, just sometimes, justice actually won. This story didn't end with Marcus getting arrested. It didn't end with officers facing consequences. It ended with a community transformed, with systems built that protect the next person, with one man's violation becoming a catalyst for accountability that extends far beyond his individual case. If this story moved you, if Marcus's fight resonated with your own experiences or your understanding of justice, I want to hear from you. Hit that like button and drop a comment below sharing what struck you most. Was it the community's response? The persistence required to achieve accountability? The way one person's courage to fight back created protection for others? Subscribe to Justice Stories, because we're committed to telling these real stories of people who faced injustice and refused to accept it as inevitable. These aren't just news items. They're roadmaps for resistance, blueprints for accountability, evidence that change is possible when people refuse to give up. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that fighting back matters, that documentation makes a difference, that community solidarity can overcome institutional power. And tell me in the comments, what does real accountability look like in your community? What systems exist or need to exist to prevent violations like Marcus experienced? Thank you for watching, for engaging, for being part of this community that refuses to let injustice disappear into silence. I'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue exploring what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary challenges and choose to fight for what's right. This has been Justice Stories. Subscribe, share, and keep fighting for accountability.